Hey man, this wasn't some loud-ass breakup with public blow-ups, no dramatic interviews, no scandal blowing up headlines day after day. On the surface, it looked like a chill, quiet ending. But behind the scenes, one legal decision flipped everything upside down. Nearly 20 years of marriage, reduced to pages of custody terms and scheduled time. And for someone who survived fame, pressure, and constant scrutiny, this was the part that hurt the most. Not money, not reputation, access. So how does a global star handle success on stage, but struggle when family court redraws their role as a parent? That question sits at the center of this story. If you care about the real stories behind celebrity headlines, consider subscribing before we continue. But the custody ruling wasn't where this really began. The marriage everyone thought was unbreakable. From the outside, their marriage looked steady as hell. Interviews were respectful. Public appearances felt grounded. They spoke about each other with admiration, often crediting teamwork and patience for making it work. In an industry known for fast breakups, this relationship became an example people pointed to as proof that long-term commitment was still possible. Fans saw consistency, not chaos. They assumed this was one of the rare Hollywood stories that avoided the usual ending. But public unity doesn't always reflect private reality. Over time, subtle shifts appeared. Appearances became less frequent. Joint interviews slowed. When they did speak, the language grew more careful, more measured. Nothing alarming on its own, but patterns matter. Those close to the situation later suggested that stress had been building quietly, away from cameras and headlines. What made this harder to spot was how well both sides maintained professionalism. There were no public complaints, no leaks meant to sway opinion. That silence reinforced the idea that everything was fine. Yet pressure doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It accumulates. And in long marriages, it often shows up not as conflict, but as emotional distance. Looking back, the signs weren't dramatic. They were subtle. Missed moments, different priorities pulling in opposite directions. The image stayed intact, but the foundation was being tested in ways most people never saw. And pressure has a way of revealing cracks. Fame on two different timelines. Their careers moved forward but not in sync. One followed a touring cycle that demanded constant travel, late nights, and months away from home. The other worked within filming schedules that required extended stays in specific locations, often with rigid commitments. Neither path was wrong. Neither was careless. But the demands rarely aligned. At first, distance felt temporary. A few weeks apart became routine. Separate schedules turned into a normal part of life. Over time, that normal slowly changed how the relationship functioned. Shared routines faded. Everyday moments became harder to coordinate. What starts as flexibility can quietly become separation. Reports from people familiar with the situation suggest there were long stretches where they lived essentially parallel lives. Still married, still respectful, but often in different places, focused on different rhythms. That kind of distance doesn't always create arguments. More often, it creates silence. The challenge with long-distance dynamics is that they don't announce themselves as problems. They feel manageable until suddenly they aren't. Emotional connection needs consistency, not just intention. And when schedules never overlap, small gaps can widen before anyone notices. It's important to note that distance alone doesn't end a marriage. Many couples survive it. But when combined with other pressures, it can amplify existing differences, especially when parenting enters the equation. But distance alone doesn't decide custody. When parenting became the quiet battleground. According to people familiar with the situation, the tension didn't center on the marriage itself for long. Over time, attention shifted toward parenting decisions. Not through loud disputes, but through ongoing conversations about routines, stability, and daily structure. These discussions tend to carry more weight when families operate across different locations. Even small differences in approach can become more pronounced when schedules don't consistently overlap. Family courts don't evaluate effort or emotional intention the way many expect. They focus on practical factors: consistency, environment, predictability. Who can maintain regular routines? Who provides a stable day-to-day setting? These considerations often shape outcomes more than personal sacrifice or past involvement. It's a system designed to prioritize structure over sentiment. Sources close to the process have suggested this shift marked the real turning point. Not a dramatic disagreement, but a shared recognition that parenting under the same roof was no longer functioning smoothly. Once decisions moved into legal territory, flexibility decreased. Conversations that once allowed compromise became constrained by formal requirements. What made this phase especially difficult was that both parents reportedly wanted to remain actively involved. There is no question of disengagement, but the legal process isn't built to balance feelings evenly. It's built to select workable frameworks. And once those frameworks are defined on paper, they carry a sense of finality. Intentions may be sincere on both sides, yet outcomes still feel rigid. That's the nature of formal structure. When family decisions become legal ones, adaptability narrows. And that's where the law stepped in. The custody decision that changed everything. What changed everything wasn't a headline or a public statement. It was a legal outcome. According to court documents later reported by People, the custody arrangement resulted in a clear shift in how time was divided between households. No motives were stated. No blame was assigned. But the structure of daily life changed overnight. People confirmed that both parties waived child and spousal support, reinforcing how carefully and quietly this process was handled. That detail matters because it shows the focus wasn't financial leverage or public positioning. It was about formalizing responsibility and routine. Courts prioritized consistency, schooling, and stability, and those factors reportedly shaped the final outcome. This wasn't presented publicly as a victory or a defeat. Still, people close to the situation described the shift as brutal, not because of conflict, but because of what it represented. Years of shared parenting were reduced to fixed schedules and limited windows. The emotional weight came after the paperwork, not during it. AP News later framed the divorce itself as a private legal conclusion rather than a public spectacle, noting the absence of drama or disputes in filings. That restraint reinforced how final the decision felt once it was set. When custody structures are defined this way, flexibility narrows fast. The ruling didn't accuse or explain. It simply redirected daily life. And that redirection carried consequences no press release could capture. Quick pause dash if you value calm, well-researched stories beyond the headlines. Consider subscribing. Keith Urban after the decision. According to people close to Keith Urban, the period following the custody decision carried a quiet but heavy emotional weight. There were no public reactions, no statements of frustration, and no visible signs of conflict. Instead, his schedule tightened. Touring dates increased. Commitments filled the calendar. From the outside, it looked like forward momentum. Behind the scenes, it provided structure at a time when routine at home had changed. Music had always been a constant in his life, and during this period, it reportedly took on added importance. Some describe it as grounding. Others see it as a way to stay in motion. Both interpretations can coexist. When familiar rhythms disappear in one area of life, work often becomes the place where control and predictability return. What separated this loss from earlier career setbacks was its permanence. Professional challenges can be revisited. Tours can be rescheduled. Creative work can be reshaped. Time with children, once missed, doesn't return in the same way. According to those familiar with the situation, that reality carried a different kind of weight than any professional disappointment he had faced before. There were no public signs of resentment or bitterness, but silence itself has impact. Friends have suggested that the absence of everyday moments was harder than most people realized. When performances end and travel slows, what remains is quiet. And within that quiet, adjustment became unavoidable. The process wasn't dramatic or visible. It was gradual, a rebalancing that happened away from attention, shaped by responsibility rather than reaction. And in that space, the silence around him grew louder. Nicole Kidman's position of stability. From the court's perspective, stability carries measurable value. Reports suggest her household offered consistent location, schooling, and routine, factors that courts often prioritize. This wasn't framed as a judgment of character, but as a decision based on structure and continuity. Those elements matter heavily when long-term planning is involved. Publicly, she remained restrained. There were no interviews addressing custody, no indirect remarks, no attempts to control the narrative. That restraint shaped perception more than commentary ever could. Silence suggested confidence in the process and respect for privacy. Her approach reflected predictability, something courts look for and children benefit from. Consistent environments reduce disruption, especially during transitions. According to those familiar with the case, that consistency was central to the outcome. However, stability has another side. Carrying responsibility without public reaction can invite assumptions. Some interpret quiet as strength. Others read it as detachment. Neither is confirmed. What is clear is that choosing silence limited speculation and kept the focus on routine rather than dispute. But stability has its own consequences. Why this didn't become a public war? What's notable about this separation is the lack of public conflict. There were no televised interviews, no leaked courtroom exchanges, and no competing narratives pushed through the press. According to reporting by AP News, the divorce was finalized through standard legal filings without public disputes or hostile statements, reinforcing how deliberately low-profile the process remained. That restraint was a choice. Both individuals have spent decades building careers based on professionalism and long-term relationships. A public confrontation could have created damage far beyond the personal situation. Instead of emotional exposure, the process leaned toward privacy and resolution. Legal filings focused on structure rather than blame, keeping personal matters out of headlines. Choosing not to fight publicly often shifts the burden inward. When there's no outlet through interviews or statements, emotion doesn't disappear. It's handled privately. The public saw composure. Behind the scenes, adjustments still went down without any outside chatter or validation, This approach also limited the impact on their kids. By dodging public blow-ups, they kept a family matter from turning into straight entertainment. That protection cut down on speculation, but also meant the emotional cost wasn't visible to outsiders. AP News framing made it clear this wasn't some dramatic collapse. It was a controlled legal ending. And controlled endings can still carry deep personal consequences, even when handled carefully. Still, those close to the situation say the hardest part came later. Life after access changes. The hardest adjustment wasn't logistical, dude. It was emotional as hell. Seeing the children less rarely hits as a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolds quietly over time. Missed breakfasts. Empty seats at familiar events. The absence of ordinary routines only becomes clear once they no longer happen naturally. People close to the situation have suggested that this kind of loss doesn't fade the way many expect. It settles in deep. Schedules may become clear and predictable, but predictability can't replace presence, man. Even when communication stays open, physical distance changes how connection is felt. Time together becomes intentional rather than automatic, and that shift carries serious weight. What makes this especially difficult is the lack of a remedy. Once structures are established, there's little room to recover everyday moments. You don't renegotiate time back. You adapt. That adaptation takes effort and emotional recalibration, often without recognition or support from the outside. This period wasn't marked by dramatic gestures or public displays of struggle. There were no visible breaking points for audiences to point to. Instead, acceptance happened gradually. A new rhythm formed, not by choice, but by necessity. Over time, that rhythm reshaped priorities. Reaction slowed. Perspective changed. What once felt central had to be reconsidered. These shifts aren't always visible from the outside, but they influence how life is approached moving forward. And when access changes this way, it doesn't just alter schedules. It alters how someone sees time itself. Quick reminder, if you value calm, well-researched stories beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. Career success, personal cost. On the surface, nothing slowed down. Tours moved forward. Performances stayed polished. Public appearances projected confidence and control. From the outside, the momentum looked unchanged. On stage, there were no visible cracks. Applause filled the space where personal questions might have existed. But professional success doesn't always reflect internal stability. According to people familiar with this period, there was a growing contrast between public output and private adjustment. Work continued at full speed, while personal life required a different kind of attention that couldn't be scheduled the same way. Achievements still carried weight, but they were experienced differently than before. Loss doesn't always present itself as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as motion. Staying busy, filling calendars, meeting every obligation. Productivity can offer structure when other areas feel uncertain. That doesn't automatically mean avoidance, but it does influence how emotion is processed. When movement becomes constant, reflection often gets postponed. Reports suggest this chapter didn't cause collapse or withdrawal. Instead, it reshaped priorities. The meaning attached to success evolved. Goals that once felt central were quietly reevaluated. When personal life changes in a fundamental way, professional direction often adjusts alongside it. What makes this shift notable is its subtlety. There was no public breakdown, no visible retreat, just a gradual reordering that happened away from headlines. The work continued, but the context around it changed. And while bitterness never took center stage, the impact of that period didn't disappear either. It settled into something quieter, influencing how success was measured moving forward. But the story doesn't end with bitterness. Acceptance, not closure. This story doesn't require a villain to make sense. There are no verified betrayals, no public accusations, and no dramatic reversals that explain everything in a single moment. What remains instead is acceptance, not closure. Closure implies something ends cleanly and decisively. This didn't. It shifted into a different shape. Acceptance doesn't cancel loss. It makes space for life to continue without constant resistance. That process rarely follows a straight line. Healing moves slower than headlines, and in many cases, it never arrives in a neat or complete way. Some experiences don't resolve themselves through explanation or agreement. They remain part of the story, carried forward rather than left behind. What makes this ending quieter than many expected is the absence of retaliation. Neither side attempted to rewrite the past or frame the situation for public sympathy. There were no speeches meant to sway opinion and no effort to turn personal change into spectacle. That restraint limited public damage, but it also demanded discipline and emotional control behind the scenes. When relationships last decades, they don't disappear overnight. They dissolve gradually, through adjustments that are felt more than announced. 20 years didn't vanish in a single decision. They settled into something different, something that required acceptance rather than resolution. And sometimes, the hardest endings aren't the ones marked by conflict or noise. They're the ones that unfold quietly, leaving people to move forward without clear answers, but with the responsibility to keep living anyway. The bottom line, what 20 years really means. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow unraveling that happened quietly, over time, shaped by distance, structure, and choices that didn't always align. From the outside, it may look like another celebrity divorce. But when you strip away fame, schedules, and public image, what's left is something far more human. The heaviest part wasn't headlines or career impact. It was the emotional weight of custody, the shift in access, the moments that no longer happen automatically. This story doesn't ask you to choose sides. There's no clear winner and no villain. Just two people navigating a system designed to prioritize stability, even when that stability comes with personal cost. Fame may amplify attention, but it doesn't protect anyone from loss. In some ways, it makes quiet pain even harder to process. If stories like this help you see beyond headlines and understand what's really at stake, consider subscribing for more thoughtful breakdowns like this. Because sometimes the true meaning of 20 years isn't found in how something ends. It's found in what changes afterward, and how people learn to live with what remains.